Next step is approval of the House. Had a bit of a change in plans. JP Danko is got a two-way trip to the Saguenay and Sudbury because of some scheduling conflicts. So safe travels. JP, I know you'll enjoy Mario's company very much. He'll treat you well. Maybe. And on Thursday, October 20th, we will start the forestry study. If everybody agrees, I propose to invite the Department of Natural Resources for an hour and do drafting instructions on this, our critical minerals study, in the second hour. So on to our meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and motion adopted on Thursday, September 18th, 2025, the committee resume its study of development of critical minerals in Canada. And I would like to give a warm welcome to National Chief, Assembly of First Nations, Cindy Woodhouse, from Manitoba, by the way, my home province. I get to see the National Chief pretty regularly, often on a plane from her home province. Also with us is Julie McGregor, Acting Chief of Staff to the National Chief, Assembly of First Nations, and Benjamin Green Stacy, who National Chief, I believe, is an advisor to the Chief. So, with that, again, thank you for being with us today, National Chief. Because you're the only witness today, normally it's 5 minutes, but there's latitude. We really want to hear from you. We know that you have important things to share, and I know colleagues will have some questions for you shortly. So please proceed.
Hello. Oh, it works.
You're on.
Jimmy Gwetch for welcoming me here today up at your kitchen and I also thank Creator for bringing us together this morning and for giving us all another day of life. I want to also just say for the tech people in the room, sometimes these committees happen really quick. And I remind Parliament and, of course, the Senate itself to make sure that you are reaching out to A, First Nations, or B, to the Assembly of First Nations, and we can certainly help you when committees come up and parliamentary committees come up to make sure that the voices in this country are all heard. And it's not like we're all going to get along every single time, but at the same time, I think that it's so important to hear the voices of Canadians, including First Nations. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you for welcoming me here today. Chair, good morning, and to all of the members that are gathered here, I'd like to acknowledge again that we are gathering here on the territory of the Algonquin Nation. I want to thank the committee for the invitation to appear today. First and foremost, First Nations maintain sovereignty over their lands, over their waters and territories, and the development of critical minerals must include the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations. Now is the time to recognize the strength of First Nations as partners in facing geopolitical uncertainty and threat of increasing U.S. colonialism. First Nations lands hold vast deposits of critical minerals and fresh water supplies that sustain communities on both sides of the border. As National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, we are pleased to submit the Assembly of First Nations technical brief on critical minerals development. So we have that here today. Our written submission provides detailed recommendations in 5 key areas. For the sake of time, though, we will be focusing our remarks today on the first 3 areas of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples: economic reconciliation and water rights, while noting that the content on environment and gender-based violence issues are fully developed in our technical brief. Sorry. Canada must ensure that all mining projects and activities taking place on or that will affect First Nations lands and waters, which is all of this beautiful country, adhere to the minimum standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly Article 32. Past legislative development processes where this did not happen, such as the Natural Resource Transfers Act. need to be corrected in collaboration with First Nations. For example, this committee should support First Nations' call for a constitutional review of the Natural Resource Transfers Act. All of Canada's laws and policy, including both their final content and the process for the development, must be compliant with Section 5 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and the objectives of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples itself. Economic reconciliation must guide critical minerals policies and activities. Economic reconciliation must not be an afterthought, but a guiding principle of Canada's critical minerals strategy. Economic reconciliation means policies and programs must enable First Nations to fully participate not just as stakeholders, but as rights holders, equity partners, and co-developers. As one example, despite its recent enhancements, the Indigenous Loan Guarantees Program is fundamentally not designed to address community infrastructure needs, which are the fundamental barrier to economic inclusion and self-determination. Not only that, but it appears that the Loan Guarantee Program has effectively replaced Canada's 2022 commitment to developing a natural benefits sharing framework. With the increasing attention to critical minerals and fast-track projects, recommitting to a comprehensive benefit sharing framework with a distinction-based approach will be critical to ensure that First Nations benefit from any resource development, including mining, on their territories. More generally, Canada's approach to critical minerals development must include collaboration with First Nations to identify strategic infrastructure and development projects that can serve community needs, support participation in the critical mineral supply chain, and strengthen Canada's broader economic and defence priorities. This is what we mean when we say that collaboration with First Nations on strategic dual-use infrastructure projects will serve both community and industrial purposes and will ensure prosperity for all. On recognizing and implement First Nations rights to water, water is life, and the protection of First Nations water rights must guide all critical minerals policy. In addition to surface disturbances from extractive activities and associated infrastructure, mining activities produce polluting waste, including tailings and wastewaters. Disasters such as the Mount Polley in British Columbia tailings breach shows that spills and contamination persist, and too often First Nations are the last to be informed. We are looking to this committee to recommend to the Government of Canada to introduce First Nations water legislation that ensures safe drinking water and wastewater standards, respects the interests, rights, and unique needs of First Nations, reinforces the human right to water and to sanitation, and includes robust provisions for a statutory funding framework. The recommendations that we have summarized today are elaborated in the AFN's technical submission to this committee. So, Chimigwech, we'd be happy to take questions now on this important issue.
Well, thank you, National Chief, for that presentation. And indeed, we welcome briefs, technical briefs, and I know the members will look at that very carefully. And so we'll start our round of questions with Mrs. Stubbs for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Grand Chief, and your delegation for being here. I come from Treaty 6, and I was very honored and privileged to be able to meet you at Transport Committee in June when we discussed C5. So to that end, given that critical mineral development is part and parcel, at least, according to the government's claims about C5 development they want to advance, even though they've been in government for 10 years, I wonder, given the comments you've made here today and previously about the significant investment that mining projects can bring to remote regions where often there are Indigenous communities with all kinds of lack of infrastructure and essential needs. In your view, has the federal government done enough to align with the Assembly of First Nations and other rights and title holders' vision of economic reconciliation so that communities can be ensured long-term sustainable opportunities for self-reliance and economic opportunity?
first of all, when it comes to the Assembly of First Nations, we're the collective organizer. We're not a rights holder. I just wanted to say that for the record. There are 634 rights holders from coast to coast to coast, and we're so grateful to be, the political organized, we organize and bring them together twice a year. And so we're thankful for the participation of First Nations from coast to coast to coast at the AFN. I think from the creation of this entire country, every single government has failed First Nations people. And I do want to lift up in recent years that, the apology, for instance, from little things that matter, right, to our relationship. Stephen Harper's apology, for instance, on residential schools. Paul Martin's commitment, first and foremost, when he was there to try and push the Kelowna Accord. Justin Trudeau, who's done well in trying to bring up the living standards for First Nations. So you kind of look back at all of that, and yes, I'm glad when Prime Minister and their governments try. But at the same time, they have to, here we are. I'm glad we're around this table today, but we did have to push a little bit to make sure that we had a space around this House, around Senate. And I think that we can do things a lot better when it comes to, we do have a $350 billion gap, on infrastructure gap in communities. And then the government comes in, just in the spring and over 20 days, rams through Bill 5. And that was very fast and very tough for First Nations. We were kind of shut out of Parliament. I mean, I'm glad we had a few moments to discuss, our stance on it. But at the same time, there was lots of leadership here that wanted to speak in this House. And I think that it's so important as Canadians that we make sure that we don't govern like that together. We need to protect the fact that there's, environmentalists, Canadians, First Nations people, groups that want to talk about some of these issues, and those voices should never be shut down. So have things improved in some parts. At the same time, there's a long way to go. We have to work on procurement problems. There's too many pretendians out there, and there's too many companies not engaging with First Nations but saying that they are Indigenous. There's that issue alone. But when it comes to the critical minerals development, we have to make sure that First Nations on the ground have free, prior, and informed consent. And we need to work on, of course, the recommendations that we're giving here today. Thank you.
Chief, what concerns me is that neither your organization nor rights and title holders were adequately consulted in the development of C5, which we discussed during that time. Now I have concerns, although I have great respect for the individuals on the Indigenous Advisory Board for the Major Projects Office, but given your comments about the requirement and the court precedents that sufficient duty to consult requires a two-way dynamic with decision makers at the table. C5 sets out politicians as decision makers, cabinet. Do you think that the inclusion of an Indigenous Advisory Board is going to be enough to fulfill the Crown's duty to consult, which is what is important? Also, given the fact that Conservatives supported the Liberals' claim through C69 that they were going to provide capacity funding for sufficient engagement of Indigenous communities, because we all know that getting to yes in a good way is the only way that these projects can be built. So do you have concerns that decisions coming out of that will face challenge or litigation, or do you want to expand on how that can properly be done with that two-way dynamic and decision makers at the table?
Yeah, Julie.
So yes, well, just to go back to your earlier question in terms of do we feel that the Bill C5, has that consultation on all of those promises to sort of go back and have that engagement been occurred, and not to our knowledge. I think there's a long way to go in terms of going directly to rights holders. As National Chief said, the engagement was very brief before the bill, and now following it, we think there's a long road to go in terms of ensuring that First Nations are properly involved in the process. In terms of the advisory committee, I mean, I think we hold up the people who are involved in that. However, that's not a replacement for rights holders and direct engagement with those individuals.
I
Thank
share
you.
that concern. I hope that you're listened to.
Yeah. Thank you, Mrs. Stubbs. And we're just going to pause for one moment to exchange your name tag. A little spelling error there. There we go. We're now over to Mr. Hogan for 6 minutes. Mr. Hogan.
Thank you, and thank you, Grand Chief. It's great to see you again. You were one of
Folks,
the...
it's national,
Oh, I'm
Chief.
sorry, National Chief. You were one of the first individuals I met as a newly sworn-in MP in a new government, and you made me feel very welcome, and I appreciate that greatly. And while new government, one that stands on the progress of other governments, the work you mentioned of Prime Minister Martin, Harper, Trudeau, and as has been discussed, it's reconciliation is a long road, one that requires us to move backwards and address past wrongs, but also knowing that we don't have a time machine and we need to move forward in a better way and walk paths together in a better way. And of course, one of the ways that needs to be done is through free, prior, and informed consent. And one of the things we've heard from other witnesses, of course, is capacity building is very important. And I'm wondering if you could take the opportunity to expand on capacity building, your view of the level of resourcing for sure, and obviously that we have heard needs to be increased, but also the approach to capacity building that's been taken, and if there are things the government should consider as it looks at critical minerals.
I think we can list several. They are complex, long-standing, systemic, and frankly unacceptable. But perhaps the most poignant one is that I'm the only one here. That's the problem. You can't just have the national chief representing all First Nations who are stewards of the land, water, and resources that are this country is eager to exploit. Canada needs to be more proactive in engaging rights holders from coast to coast, and we'll be there to help you as the AFN. And that includes, at the absolute minimum, inviting more First Nations as witnesses in this study. I'm hoping that we can do that for next week. These are the basics when we insist on nothing about us, of course, without us. But beyond that, key barriers include limited access to capital, which constrains opportunities for equity participation and project investment, capacity challenges across the project life cycle, including proposals during flexibility studies, due diligence, and technical assessment, navigating complex permitting processes that are often difficult to navigate without specialized technical experts in the field. Also, general distrust of industry stemming from negative experience, including limited transparency and insufficient early engagement. Lack of infrastructure, as I know we talked about that earlier, such as roads, energy, and broadband, particularly in remote and northern regions. Some of our kids don't even have access to high-speed internet or wired-in internet, and we have a long way to go on that. And that's just one piece. Socioeconomic factors stemming from colonial policies and programs as well, and lack of consideration or meaningful engagement in the development of federal strategies or regulatory processes. So lots to discuss, right? Those are just some barriers.
And you mentioned becoming equity partners, and I think broadly the structuring of deals is something that we've also heard from witnesses about. And there's been many comments about the difficulty of accessing equity, becoming meaningful partners. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that you want to share with the committee.
My friend.
Accessing equity is only one part of meaningful participation in Canada's economy by First Nations. When you think about these major projects, there are opportunities to generate a lot of revenue for a lot of government, for a lot of private interests, for a lot of corporate and shareholder interests. But for First Nations communities, the reality day to day is that there might not be access to high-speed internet. There might not be access to clean drinking water. And so when you see programs like ILGP that provide access to capital for investment in for-profit major projects, they don't do anything to address on-reserve challenges, which is why the National Benefit Sharing Framework needs to have a dedicated First Nations chapter. That's why it's a priority. We need to address real day-to-day problems that affect people's lives and ability to function and live before we start talking about major projects that can line pocketbooks.
If I could just add to that on as we had said in my speech there, I look to this committee and your political will to call for a constitutional review on the Natural Resource Transfers Act. The Natural Resource Transfers Act, I don't know if you all know what that is, but they were agreements between the federal government and 3 provincial governments that purported to transfer control over Crown lands and natural resources to 3 prairie provinces. This occurred without the free, prior, and informed consent of the First Nations whose lands and resources were affected. This shift in jurisdiction has complicated First Nations participation in resource development, including critical mineral development. A decision about our traditional lands and territories have continued to be made without our input. This committee must acknowledge the Natural Resources Transfers Act as a fundamental impediment to First Nations economic development and self-determination, and support the First Nations in Assembly call for a constitutional review of the NRTA and its compatibility with Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. So we look to you all to stand with us and call for that. And you see one province trying to threaten to leave to the U.S., so unacceptable. She doesn't even have land to take. You know, that land is Treaty 6, 7, and 8. That's their, their lands. And so I know they're tough discussions to be had, but pieces of legislation like this that impact us from the 1920s to continue to prog us down today. And I think that we could do better as a country. And let's get to the table. Let's have these big discussions, and even though they're uncomfortable, we can make a better country by working together in a better way. So thank you.
And thank you both. And we're going to move to our final speaker in the first round, Monsieur Simard, pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais, Madame la chef nationale, vous laisser le temps d'installer l'écouteur. Oui, voilà. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien? Oui. Est-ce que vous... Oui, vous m'entendez? Bon. J'ai une voix un peu plus radiophonique que les interprètes, donc... Non, j'adore les interprètes. Donc, vous venez de terminer une...
You've just completed an answer. You were talking about having difficult conversations that we need to have, nation-to-nation conversations. And as a representative of the Bloc Québécois, I understand exactly what you mean. You talked about reviewing legislation and transferring control of territory. In your view, is your conversation with the federal government on an equal-to-equal basis? And if not, how do we arrive at that in the short term? Particularly given that critical minerals are going to become a rapidly developing field. So what needs to be done for an equal-to-equal, for a dialogue between equals with First Nations?
So, look, that's a good question. And I think one way, I know that there's so many other ways, but we're, and we always jump forward to participate in federal, provincial, territorial meetings. And we're invited for a couple of hours the day before. And then the next day, when the federal government comes in with the premiers, for instance, they'll talk to us for maybe an hour or two. I always tell them the little kiddie table. And I know I got into an argument with the premiers this summer about that, but we thankfully went out of there and we were united. But it's tough when, for instance, on healthcare, or if it was this issue or that issue, and you come together and you speak about these things, there's always like an hour set aside to talk about Indigenous issues. And then the provinces and the feds are like, okay, thank you, go out now. And then we're excluded out of those talks. And I think that has to change in this country. It's, it's always so disrespectful to have to leave the next day when the real business gets talked about. And I know this, this past summer I'd met with all the premiers and I said, like, make a seat for us at the table. And they said, well, we always need a seat at the, our own, our own group to talk as premiers. I get that. But when you're speaking with the feds and First Nations people are left to the side, no, who's speaking for us? Nobody. And everyone just wants to say they have jurisdiction over us, but yet nobody's speaking for us, and we often get left out of big conversations. And it always seems like it's always the elephant in the room. I mean, here's another example. I was saying to like Indian Affairs, and I'll always call it Indian Affairs. I know you guys switch that name every few years to Indigenous Services and everything else, but they're Indian Affairs. There's not even an FPT table for them. There's no talking space for the provinces and the feds to speak with First Nations directly on many issues, on healthcare, on education, on big projects. Like, there's no set space where those conversations are having. And I think if we did, we'd be farther ahead as a country instead of piecemealing and always trying to get our voices heard. So I think that's one thing, including us as true partners in this country.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but if I understand what you've said correctly, there's an appearance of consultation, but that's basically a facade, and it serves the purpose of letting the government say they've consulted you. But to be a real consultation, it would have to go deeper. I have questions on the concept of prior and informed consent. It remains difficult to define, particularly in circumstances like those that obtain now, where with Bill C-5, the government can take a number of liberties with regulatory processes and standards. What I'd like to know is whether there are mechanisms that provide you with some kind of support. There are technical and technological considerations that are highly complex when it comes to mining project development. I don't know if you have any support whatsoever to find your way through all that. Before you can give a free, prior, and informed consent, you need to have the right information. So is there a mechanism on natural resource development projects that makes it possible for you to obtain and understand this information?
It's a really good question, and it's actually a very big challenge in terms of major projects, natural resources projects going forward, that there's inconsistency in terms of support that First Nations have. You're right, the regulatory processes are very complex, very long, and the process of the lifespan of a project can have several regulatory processes that First Nations just don't have the capacity to participate in, to meaningfully participate, because that's the law, right? Even in duty to consult, First Nations have to be meaningfully engaged in the process. Often that's left to industry to provide that support. The Crown often delegates their authority to that. And that leaves for inconsistent application of, there's really no mechanism beyond the fact that it's a legal standard, but there's no uniform mechanism for First Nations and rights holders to be meaningfully part of the engagement, the consultation, and as you say, free, prior, and informed consent. That standard requires exactly that, free, that's their First Nations being willing to do this, prior, beforehand, and informed, meaning that they have all the information in front of them in order to engage in the process. That's the standard, and there should be the adequate resourcing for them to do that as well, for a multitude of reasons, but mainly because of the ones that National Chief said. There's an infrastructure gap. There's underfunding, chronic underfunding. First Nations are always at a situation where they're having to try and manage a multitude of social and economic factors, along with being a part of a complex regulatory process.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Simon. Thank you, Ms. McGregor. Colleagues, we're going to go to our second round, starting with Monsieur Mallette, followed by Monsieur Gay, and then Monsieur Simard. Monsieur Mallette for 5 minutes.
Please go ahead.
National Chief Woodhouse Nipinak, Wachi. Since the introduction of Bill C-69 and its framework for impact assessment, has the government fulfilled its commitment to meaningfully consult and consider Indigenous communities in project reviews?
To answer your question, it depends on the project, obviously, but overall, I don't think if you were to sort of canvass rights holders whether they feel they've been adequately consulted on these things, no. I think, as National Chief mentioned, Bill C-5 was sort of the example of how things go in terms of major projects and consultation and FPIC, that, you know, you're given a very quick turnaround time to provide your consultation, and there's not adequate resources to do it, so I'd say no.
So you said depending on the projects, would you have a project that would be a model? Or maybe not a model, but that could guide us?
The best examples of Impact Assessment Act implementation would be the regional impact assessments that are happening right now for the St. Lawrence and for the Ring of Fire. But with the implementation of Building Canada Act, with the progress of these major projects, there's no guarantee, there's no certainty that the findings of these assessments will be in any way considered before these projects are authorized and are implemented. And that's unacceptable. One of the recommendations that we're making in the report is that regional development plans be developed and supported with First Nations. And what that could look like is a comprehensive regional impact assessment.
On that same line, should we prioritize deeper consultation with Indigenous communities and empower them to lead negotiations directly with resource companies? What's your thought on that?
Yes.
Look, I think absolutely, and in a respectful way. I know that there was one company, for instance, and I've talked to him extensively about this. Relationships are important in this country for all of us, no matter if it's in business, in politics, in industry, anywhere, right? And it was disheartening. I know that there was one company that reached out to Chief Jeff Copeness from the Onigamings, and very disrespectful to him, and called him down on an email at that same day, which was interesting enough. And I had to reply. I felt terrible for the chief to have to see abuse like that from a mining exploration company, to be so disrespectful to him. At the same time, then you see the relationships being built in another province that same day with the premier and different First Nations groups and different industry people coming together at another place. That was nice to see, but at the same time, see the different contrast on that. And relationships are important. And at the same time, if any smart company wants to do business somewhere, anywhere in Canada, figure out where you're going and which First Nations are impacted in that area, and pick up the phone and call them. First Nations, people think it's so complex, but just like anywhere else, if you're developing somewhere, are wanting to develop somewhere, you have to make sure that you reach out to those First Nations. And they're human too. They'll pick up the phone and they'll tell you if they want to speak to you or not. And they've been just like any one of us. So thank you.
Well, you've touched on a word. Relationships are extremely important, and different people may interpret it differently, which is always sad. But Madam McGregor, your answer was a strong yes on my question, but could you elaborate a little bit on it?
Well, I obviously picking up on
Points to change
it. Well, again, there's capacity issues to begin with. I think we need to start looking at the infrastructure gap, as National Chief said. I mean, it's a huge part of the problem when looking at these major projects going forward, that First Nations are you know, it's not even a thought in anybody's mind that there is a lack of water, clean water. There's a lack of, as National Chief said, broadband technology, but even roads. We don't even have winterized roads in the north for First Nations communities. So instead of looking at it as how do we sort of solve the problem to get to the yes, or however you want to look at it, of the consent of it, start looking at it in terms of it's a whole process. Infrastructure, solving the infrastructure gap is a major project in Canada. It is part of ensuring that First Nations are engaged in processes and fully partners in these mining projects that are happening, or national resources projects that are happening. So there's the capacity, but understanding that the capacity is also rooted in a major infrastructure problem across Canada. And then again, like National Chief said, the engagement part of it, the relationship part of it, sitting down with people and actually learning from the communities their knowledge and their impacts on their rights and their lands, and ensuring that there's a certain level of benefit to the communities as well. It can't be just a one-shot deal for approval processes, that there's a benefit brought to the community. And it has to be longstanding and something that benefits future generations of First Nations.
Thank you. So we have Mr. Gay for 5 minutes, Monsieur Simard for 2.5, and then Monsieur Martel and Mr. McKinnon, and then we'll wrap up this round. You get 5.
5 minutes.
Oh. Yeah.
Generous around.
Yes, we are. We are. Then, sorry, Monsieur Simard, 2.5. But I've been giving a little latitude to some of the, because we have important guests. Yeah. But go ahead, Monsieur Gay.
National Chief, thank you very much for being here with us. We really appreciate. I want to reassure you that we've actually had other First Nation representatives that actually came to the committee before you. It may not be an exhaustive list, as you highlighted how many rights holders we have in this country. But I would appreciate your recommendation if you look at the list, and if you think we should have others prioritize, because of course we're not going to be able to meet all of them, but we welcome your feedback and your input on some of the most representative one. So I really wanted to give you that message. The second question, well, the real question that I wanted to ask you is, I haven't had a chance to read your report, but one of the things, particularly with the Ministry of Natural Resources, Energy and Natural Resources, we're very interested in developing templates for agreements with the First Nation. I'll come back and talk about the loan guarantee, but as you pointed out, this is only a small or one aspect. The equity aspect is only one aspect of project, but I'm interested in your knowledge of best practices. Like you said, some projects are done well and some could be much improved in the process of consultation and participation of the First Nation. So I'm wondering, and I've heard a lot about capacity, infrastructure, but I'm actually interested if you could help us with your feedback. What are the list of elements that we should contemplate on any major project with the First Nation? And more than just ticking a box, but to give us insight as to the elements that should be considered either by the promoters or by the government or by the First Nation themselves. So that's the first question.
Well, thank you for your question. Absolutely look to support First Nations in critical mineral development projects. The federal government must take a leadership role in setting standards for respectful, inclusive, and rights-based engagement. This includes requiring project proponents to involve First Nations early in decision-making processes and ensuring that engagement is not rushed or treated as a checkbox exercise. The government can also play a critical role by directly funding First Nations-led projects and related infrastructure, which are often foundational to participation. Facilitating partnerships, including co-ownership and equity opportunities, is another way that the federal government can make a difference. In addition, developing and sharing best practice templates for partnership agreements, benefit sharing models, and community engagement approaches can guide companies in building meaningful and lasting relationships with First Nations. Ultimately, the federal government must be grounded in recognition of First Nations rights and focused on creating the condition for equitable participation in the critical mining economy. I don't know if you want to add anything further. Are we good?
I want to say one thing in terms of cautioning, in terms of looking for templates and quick sort of ways of going around this. Sometimes in our world, slow is fast. When we say rights holders, we're not joking. Like these are constitutionally recognized rights, and First Nations will go to court to protect their rights. So if you don't consult properly, if you don't make sure that an agreement really meets the needs of that community, and all communities are different, then you will see issues in terms of protracted litigation on these projects. So before you slam down a template agreement and say, here you go, take it or leave it, remember that you really need to consult with the communities, you need to engage with them, you need to get their prior informed consent, and you need to understand what they need. And that takes a long, it's not as easy as a template agreement.
Thank you. Monsieur Simard, 2 points.
Mr. Simard, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Can you hear me? We're looking at the study we're undertaking now on the deployment of critical minerals. One of the major problems, major difficulties, is the lack of infrastructure. Critical minerals are generally in the north, and many Indigenous communities are also in the north on the territory. So in establishing the infrastructures, you talked about co-development, and a model I find interesting is a partnership with Indigenous communities to develop those infrastructure, be it railways or roads. To your knowledge, is there a project of that kind underway already in which communities are partners in infrastructure development?
Do you want me to answer? Thank you. Thank you very much. Look, the key to supporting First Nations in the participation of emerging critical mining systems is closing the infrastructure gap. For decades, First Nations have called on Canada to address the chronic underinvestment and neglect that have caused the staggering socioeconomic and infrastructure gaps between First Nations and the rest of this country. Through ministerial mandates and the speech from the throne, Canada has stated and reiterated its commitment to close the infrastructure gap in First Nations by the year 2030. To advance this joint priority, in partnership with industry-leading engineering and consulting firms, the Indigenous Services and the AFN have quantified the cost and benefits to closing the infrastructure gap in First Nations by 2030, which now exceeds $360 billion and includes nearly every infrastructure asset class, including roads, ports, energy, and telecommunications. One of the main barriers to mineral development in Canada is a lack of infrastructure in remote regions. Connectors that make it easier to engage in mineral development are also connectors for First Nations, meaning that there are a variety of economic and social co-benefits that come from federal economic investments in related infrastructure. Canada's approach to critical minerals development must also include collaboration with First Nations to identify strategic dual-use infrastructure and development projects that can serve community infrastructure needs and support First Nations participation in the critical mineral supply chain, the green energy transition, and Canada's defence industrial base more broadly. I hope that that's helpful. I don't know if you
Yes, and that brings us to the end of your 2.5 minutes. Go ahead, Ms. McGregor. Go ahead.
There's a sort of a theme to that the members are asking for specific examples. And we represent, we're an advocacy body of 634 First Nations, but we're just the advocacy body. If you really wanted examples of good examples or even bad examples of where infrastructure projects with communities have partnered with communities, you really should invite the First Nations rights holders to the committee, expand your study, and let those voices be heard, because then you will get detailed information about successful projects or ones that weren't so successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McGregor. So we're on to our last two speakers, Mr. Martel for 5 minutes and Mr. McKinnon wrapping up for us. And then we'll have a break.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Good afternoon, Ms. Woodhouse. Economic development projects, yes, we do have them. And we do, at present, need them, given the geopolitical situation. As a clear message from there, we need to create wealth. I'd like to say that, in my view, an economic development project always takes too long to see the light of day. We miss the timing and you miss an opportunity. So I don't believe that we can't get things done faster, and I'd like to hear you say how that could be done. Yes, there are regulations and negotiations, but in my view, I do think we could be moving faster.
Thank you very much. I think the federal government can do better by working with First Nations, and I think that includes including us as true partners, ensuring that all benefits are shared, including revenues generated from resource extraction, providing funding for early engagement and capacity building, also embedding Indigenous participation plans, IPP, in project governance and regulatory processes, promoting also equity partnerships, revenue sharing agreements, and impact benefit agreements. So I think, I don't know if you want to add further to that, but I think that's one way we want to say, we want to fast track this. Why not start working together? So, okay.
I think, just to add to that, I think if the government wanted to play a role in that, they could, encourage the implementation of the UN Declaration as part of the process of the regulatory process. And also look at different reports. There's been so many reports with respect to the cost of doing business and the human cost of that in our communities, like the final report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. That had to do a lot with the impacts of these projects as well. So it would be good for those recommendations to be revisited as well.
Ma prochaine question.
My next question is this. Does every development project on Indigenous territory, or should it, require unanimity from all Indigenous communities affected before it can move forward?
I think, obviously, in the development of the law in Canada and in terms of looking at it from the UN Declaration, it is a question of the rights and interests that are affected, right? So there's communities that are, directly where a potential mining project is right in their backyard. But there's also communities that may be downstream from the project that may be affected. You really have to look at the rights that are affected, and to do that, you have to consult with the rights holders so that they can tell you exactly how they're going to be affected by something. And then it's a matter of how do you address those concerns? It's not a question of does everybody have to agree? Does everybody have to say yes? Does everybody have to say no? It's a question of what are the interests and the rights being affected.
Madame Cindy.
Ms. Woodhouse, you spoke of a fear of giving you a seat at the table, the decision-making table. You said the government had some fears about that. you must have some idea why they don't want to give you a seat at the table. Could you tell us why, in your view, that could be happening?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been happening for a long time. I feel for national chiefs before me, I can think of the likes of Perry Bellegarde, of Phil Fontaine, Ovid McCurdy, and I know that they always have to push, like, for instance, a First Ministers meeting, we have one now, thanks to the premiers being united. I thank all the premiers. At the same time, we had tough conversations around the table on participation in this country. At the same time, we came out of that, First Nations and the premiers united, that we do need a First Ministers meeting to talk about some of these issues. And, we await I've also talked to the Prime Minister the other day, and he's open to that. So I know that we have to do that, but I think more importantly, how do we work more consistently across this country to make sure that that we're inclusive with each other, that every time that there is a Council of the Federation meeting or a First Ministers meeting, like, we're glad for that couple hours before, but at the same time, as foundational people who had contributed to the creation of this country, we need to be more respected to make sure that we're around those decision-making tables more than ever before. And I think every single war, every single time that this country has faced tough times, First Nations have signed up in more numbers than anybody else in this country to be at the front lines. We'll continue to do so, and we stand with Canadians, against illegal tariffs towards our country, and we stand with you to try and make sure that there is prosperity for all. But at the same time, we need to be more respectful of each other, and we need to make space for each other to meet, to talk, and to have these conversations, not in the public eye, but together, sitting and making those decisions together. So, yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. McKinnon, you have 5 minutes, and then we'll take a break.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all for being here today. National Chief, you mentioned the importance of more equity participation. And I note that we have this loan guarantees program that has been increased from $5 billion to $10 billion. I think that's a step in the right direction, but I'm wondering what we can do to make that more useful.
Thank you very much. I also want to remind all of the members here that we do also, I do want to lift up, I know it's not in my notes, but the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. There are 181 First Nations that are united in that, and I want to uplift them for their work on the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, and I commend their advocacy for that. I don't know if you want to add further on the Indigenous Loan Guarantee. I know that our techs will have some stuff to say on that, but let's make that the best that it can be. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the program has Indigenous grants of a maximum of $200,000. But throughout the life of the process, that could be eaten up pretty quickly in terms of technical expertise and engagement. Increased grants, increased amounts for First Nations participation and engagement and capacity building. And if you look at it, I mean, it's a lot, $10 billion for sure. But we're going to keep banging on the drum about the infrastructure gap. We're talking about a $400 billion infrastructure gap. You're trying to plug a $400 billion hole with a $10 million loan guarantee program. It's not a fix-all. It's not a cure-all. We've obviously talked previously about there needing to be impact and benefit agreements and more benefits to the communities. But I mean, it's a great program. Like National Chief said, we definitely lift up those who are involved in developing it. But just to know that it's not a lot compared to what the ground we're trying to make up to ensure that there's First Nations participation.
So are you saying that we need to increase the kind of categories that are supported under this program? Or do we need to increase the amounts of the loans available, or do we need to do both?
The grants.
The grants, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just say, hello? Oh.
Yep.
I just say, yeah, of course, we always need to expand and replicate. Like, well, I'm glad that this is now one solution. I'm glad we look to it to be expanded, absolutely. We want all of you to help us get that expanded and to replicate the Indigenous Loan Guarantee to finance First Nations-led infrastructure projects that address community infrastructure needs and support Canada's broad economic, environmental, and defense priorities, including the critical mineral strategy. So I hope that that's helpful. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's been a lot of discussion today around the need for consultation, and I fully agree with that. We're also hearing from industry, though, that the need to get to decisions quickly is very important for the flow of capital, for applying capital to projects. So I'm wondering how we can improve the consultation process, what kind of mechanisms we can do so that we can get to the decisions we need with appropriate consultation, but in a timely manner. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think Ben will pick up where I left off, but he did mention the regional consultation framework agreements that need to be sort of, that's one of our recommendations, again, is to support those. And engaging early on with First Nations communities is key to that. Like I said, sometimes slow is fast in this process, and industry has to understand that as well. You know, it's not, we tend to look at it and say that there's, oh, that's a roadblock. It's not a roadblock. It's a strengthening of your program or your project, when you have that involvement early on and you're guided by the communities on what they want to see to be involved in this. That just makes everything stronger in terms of your project, faster in terms of your project. So industry, I think industry gets it. Government also has to get it too, so.
I'm also going to add to that when there's missions around the world and Canada's wanting to, put itself out there. If you're out there and there's no First Nations people in your delegation, then even that's just a step back, right? Like I was quite disappointed last year on a technology conference, for instance, I think it was in Germany. There was Canada was selling itself there and, good for Canada, but there was no First Nations representation. There are First Nations people in Canada. 634 First Nations, and to make sure that when we go as a country around the world that you're including First Nations people and that you'll have a lot of, if we can improve our relationship with each other, with First Nations and Canadian, and the provinces and the federal government, things will go better. And so I just had to throw that in there. Thank you.
Thank you, National Chief, and thank you for your important testimony today. Thank you, Ms. McGregor, Mr. Green, Stacey, and very important testimony. And we welcome the brief that I'm sure will amplify on some of these points. And I think you can tell colleagues were very engaged. Good questions by all, and a very fruitful hour indeed. And your recommendations and your brief will be considered carefully, I assure you. The analysts have been scribbling. I know your arm is sore, Laura. But and with that, colleagues, we're going to break for 5 minutes and welcome the next set of witnesses. Colleagues, if we could gather.
Missing a lot on the CPC.
We are, Martel. We've got Mr. Mallet.
Mr. Rowe, Mr. Mallet.
I think Mr. Rowe is left. Yeah.
Okay,
Guys, okay if I start? Yeah.
you can start.
Okay, let's reconvene, and I start there? Okay, yes, and just like to make a few comments for the benefit of our witnesses, particularly those online. So for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Also, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either Floor English or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. And I would like to welcome our witnesses on the second panel. We have Heather Exner-Pirot, Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And she is online. Meg Gingrich, Assistant to the National Director, United Steelworkers of Canada.
In the room.
In the room. And Francois Soucy, Legislative Representative, United Steelworkers of Canada. Welcome. Paul Blom, Chief Operating Officer, BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council, online, I believe. So, you will each have 5 minutes or less for your opening remarks, and we are going to start with Ms. Exner-Pirot, and you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to speak to you today. Although everyone depends on mining products in their daily lives, critical minerals have only become a hot topic in the past 5 years or so. That is largely owing to, first, supply chain concerns raised by the COVID pandemic and later the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Second, the desire to electrify transportation and therefore develop more battery minerals. And most recently, concerns about our over-reliance on adversaries, particularly China, even in the basic materials needed for our defense industrial supply chain. While our attention has become focused, our policy discourses and thus responses are still not at an appropriate level of sophistication. The greatest demonstration of this is our bundling of 34 minerals and metals, half of the periodic table, into one broad category. The umbrella term critical minerals, sometimes even conflated with rare earths, is good for messaging, but is bad for policy nuance. There are at least 4 categories of minerals that call for different strategic and policy responses. The first is minerals in which Canada is dominant and has global market setting power, in which I would include potash and uranium. How can we gain leverage with our allies or disrupt authoritarian manipulation in this category? The second is minerals which are major GDP drivers for Canada. How can we enhance competitiveness, attract investment, and drive up global market share in minerals such as gold, metallurgical coal, copper, and nickel? The third is minerals for which technologies or market structures favor future growth, such as lithium, graphite, cobalt, helium, and silver. How can we ensure Canadian projects and Canadian companies are best positioned to take advantage of changes to the market cycle and be first movers? And fourth are minerals for which market structures are weak, but security of supply is essential, such as gallium, germanium, tungsten, antimony, and rare earths. What are the financial tools the state can use to develop supply in these commodities by ourselves and with our allies? In general, Canada has taken a disinterested and laissez-faire approach to our mineral sector in the past decade, rather than treating it as a strategic industry to be cultivated and fortified. Despite that, Canada retains many strengths that we can and should leverage going forward. The first is endowment. As the second largest country in the world, we have a lot of geology and a lot of untapped reserves. We're the world's top destination for exploration dollars. We need policies that make it as easy as possible to translate that mineral potential into economically competitive and thus producing projects. We don't have that today. The second is our strong mining business. The TSX and TSXV are home to about 40% of the world's publicly listed mining companies, more than any other exchange in the world. This is leverage that we need to maintain and support through policies that attract anchor listings ensure access to the biggest possible pool of foreign capital investment, and promote tax and regulatory competitiveness. Canada should want to be the first choice for mining companies to list and headquarter, but we have been losing that advantage. The third is our geopolitical reputation. The world is obviously a more complicated place these days. Global superpowers are acting in a predatory manner. We are amongst wolves, but Canada does not need to be the sheep. In my opinion, our highest and best purpose is to use our mineral, energy, and agricultural potential to ensure our friends and allies have access to the materials they need to thrive and prosper, and fend off authoritarian manipulation and volatility. To be that reliable supplier, Canada needs to produce more products competitively and get it to global markets more reliably. I hope this committee can collectively work on creating a policy environment that gets that done. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
And we will now go on to Meg Gingrich, Assistant to the National Director, United Steelworkers of Canada, and Francois Soucy. For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and to the members of the committee. My name is Meg Gingrich, and I am the Assistant to the National Director of the United Steelworkers Union in Canada, where we represent over 225,000 workers across Canada in every part of the industrial economy, including critical minerals. And I'm here with Francois Soucy, our legislative staff representative. Critical minerals are not just about the future of technology. They are about the future of work. The energy transition, our manufacturing base, and our national security all depend on whether Canada builds and processes these resources here with good union jobs, or keeps exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. Canada is well positioned to lead in the global race for critical minerals. We have major reserves of nickel, copper, lithium, graphite, cobalt, and rare earth elements. We already produce 60 minerals and metals at 200 mines and 6,500 quarries across the country. According to Statistics Canada, over 213,000 people worked in mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction in 2024. And our union represents tens of thousands of these workers. Roughly 28% of our Quebec membership, nearly a quarter in Ontario, and about 1/3 of our Canadian mining membership is in Western and Northern Canada, where there are over 30 active mines and 90 advanced projects in 2024. USW members truly form the backbone of this sector, and the potential for more good-paying unionized jobs is enormous. But it does take about 15 years to bring a mine from concept to production. If we don't accelerate investment now based on a comprehensive strategy, we'll miss our opportunity. The new Major Projects Office is a welcome step, but workers and unions must have a seat at the table from the start. And this must be done in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Development can only move quickly if it also moves responsibly, with full respect for Indigenous rights and participation in decision-making. Meaningful consultation and benefit sharing through mechanisms like impact benefit agreements are essential to ensuring projects earn local support and deliver shared prosperity. At the same time, new U.S. tariffs on Canadian copper, aluminum, and other products show the danger of relying on volatile foreign markets. Canada must build refining and processing capacity at home so the value created from our resources stays here. That means ensuring new federal programs and Canadian procurement rules are tied to real domestic benefits, not loopholes that allow imports to replace Canadian production. The steelworkers support a thorough, clear regulatory process with reasonable timelines. We also need to train and attract the next generation of skilled workers. The mining sector already employs more Indigenous people than any other private industry except construction, and Indigenous-led partnerships are proving that reconciliation and development can go hand in hand. A real critical minerals industrial strategy must build an integrated value chain, from exploration to refining, processing, manufacturing, and recycling, so the jobs and wealth remain in Canada. It must also support circular economy initiatives like battery materials recycling and the use of Canadian-made clean technology in new mines. New programs must include binding requirements for unionized labor, Canadian content, and community benefits. Public money must deliver public good. Finally, Canada needs to enforce fair trade and reward low-carbon production at home while ensuring that imported products meet the same environmental and labor standards we expect of Canadian producers. Canada has the workers, the resources, and the expertise to lead the world in responsible critical minerals development. What's needed now is the political will and coherent industrial policy to make it happen. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And now we are on to Paul Blum, and he will be wrapping up our speakers, and then we're on to questions. Paul, Mr. Blum.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to acknowledge the committee for allowing us to speak today. I'm calling in from the Nanaimo territory on the west coast of Canada. I actually happened to fly to Ottawa when we heard about this committee for a Monday presentation, but we were moved to today, and I appreciate the time through video conference. So I have about a 4 or 5 minute presentation. I'll walk through it about who our council is and about First Nations and critical minerals in British Columbia. So the First Nations Energy and Mining Council is a First Nations mandated policy and technical organization advancing rights-based participation, governance, and benefits across energy, mining, and related infrastructure in British Columbia. Our mandate is from the leadership. The council was established to serve and support the First Nations Leadership Council, which is comprised of a provincial political forum with the Assembly of First Nations, the BC Assembly of First Nations, the First Nations Summit, and the Union of BC Chiefs. Our council provides the FNLC with research, policy development, negotiation support, and implementation tools across energy and mining life cycles. What we do. First Nations, we develop First Nations-led strategies, including what I have here, if you can see it, the First Nations Energy and Mining Critical Mineral Strategy. This was developed with First Nations in British Columbia over 4 workshops in 2003, released in 2004. And we create these strategies with the advice from First Nations in British Columbia. So a lot of the answers, I listened to the National Chief's presentation and the questions, a lot of the answers are in the recommendations in this, this strategy, which I've made available to you. And I do have hard copies if the committee's interested in seeing hard copies. We support First Nations as decision makers across the project life cycle, including access, exploration, assessment, permitting, construction, operation, closure, and reclamation. We build capacity, including training, guardianship, technical literacy, convene tripartite working tables, and we catalyze fair share benefit agreements, which include equity, revenue sharing, procurement, jobs, and training. We promote green power and transmission to allow low carbon mining and processing. Why this matters. Critical minerals underpin Canada's net zero economy and supply chain security. In British Columbia, all prospective areas are on or affect First Nation lands. Project certainty and performance, therefore, depends on recognition of free, prior, and informed consent and co-governance with the rights holders who steward these lands. How we work. Our council convenes First Nations, Canada, and British Columbia in consent-based processes while engaging labor, industry, and civil society to align policy, de-risk projects, and deliver community and national benefits. What we seek a durable, investable, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples aligned critical minerals regime where First Nations are joint planners, joint decision makers, and owners, ensuring world-class environmental performance and equitable prosperity. In summary, the purpose and process, the strategy is a living province-wide framework developed by First Nations leaders and broad stakeholders to align BC and Canada's approaches with First Nations rights and practical pathways to net zero. The strategy, the core principles of the strategy, that rights and title are recognized. Decisions that affect rights require free, prior, and informed consent with processes consistent with the UN Declaration and the Truth and Reconciliation commitments. Tripartite co-decision making for environmental assessment, permitting, compliance, and adaptive management occurs through First Nations Canada and BC decision structures. First Nation guardians are resourced across the mine life. Consent-based approvals and fair share. Approval frameworks embed benefit agreements, equity, revenue, jobs, training, and procurement, grounded in value chain economics. Pathways to clean investable supply. Green power first. Off-grid deposits require renewable generation and strategic transmission corridors to allow truly low-carbon minerals. First Nations power developers should be positioned as preferred suppliers. The value chain lens, benefits and carbon are accountable across the value chain, from exploration to processing and recycling, not just at the mine gate.
Mr. Blum, we're going to have to ask you to wrap up. I know the committee's anxious to ask some questions, so if you just take 20 seconds to finish your last thought.
Thank you. And I do have a written submission which I was reading. So in closing, this strategy, the First Nations Energy and Mining Council Critical Mineral Strategy, provides a clear investable path. It combines the UN Declaration-aligned governance with green power and value chain economics to accelerate secure, ethical supplies of critical minerals while delivering durable prosperity for First Nations and Canada alike.
Well, thank you, Mr. Blum. Thank you to all of our witnesses. And just to re-emphasize the point that Mr. Blum made, we welcome written submissions, your strategy, and the other witnesses. If they want to submit something electronically, we would welcome it. So please send those in to the clerk, and she will ensure that they are made available to us and are incorporated into our testimony. So we're going to go on to our rounds of questions and comments. Starting up again, we have Mrs. Stubbs, followed by Mr. McKinnon and Monsieur Simard, each for 6 minutes. And Mrs. Stubbs, on to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses here. And as always, I regret the limited time, so just want to reinforce the Chair's comments about sending in written submissions. Dr. Exner-Perot, I know that you know well because you've spoken so much about this publicly and in all kinds of formal situations, but a 2024 survey of mining executives found that no Canadian jurisdiction is among the top 5 globally for mining investment. And you have talked often about how it takes even up to 18 years, if we're lucky, to get a mine built in Canada, which is 38% longer than the United States and 23% longer than in Australia, Canada's major competitors. You've made the case about why resource development is also important for affordability and for national security. Can you expand on the anti-development policies and laws that block building and whether or not you see C5 as a sufficient remedy?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I think, we all lament that it's taken so long in Canada to bring deposits to production. And we all see now how that's impacting not only affordability, but also our national security. We need to ramp it up. Some of it, there's many policies that have impacted this and created this. Part of it, I'll say, is just the Canadian cultural shift about 10 years ago to not appreciate the value of extractive resources, to think that they're bad or dirty or something we should be ashamed of, when obviously they're a critical part of our lives and we should be looking at ways to build it and attract talent to those sectors. Some of it is policy such as the Impact Assessment Act, which often added redundancy to provincial assessments, added timelines for sure, and added some uncertainty to investors wondering when they'll get a return on their money, when they'll start producing, and didn't always give certainty there. The industrial carbon price is also an issue in the competitiveness, especially in the processing and smelting phases, but in several others. And also clean electricity regulations. We are starting to see some energy scarcity, electricity scarcity in this company. Mines need reliable access to electricity, and we're starting to see that that's becoming a problem. We see BC, for example, introducing legislation this week to ration electricity so that they can maintain a carve-out for the mining sector. And there's lots that provinces can do, and different provinces do better than others. Saskatchewan and Quebec actually do quite well on the mining policy front, and some others need to do much better. As to whether C5, the Major Projects Office, is the solution, unlikely. There's literally hundreds of mining projects in the queue in Canada, private proponent-driven projects looking to move to the next stage, looking to attract investment, and filtering those through a bottleneck of the MPO is unlikely to produce the outcomes that we're looking for. So a broader structural reform of how we regulate extractive resources, in particular mining, is what's needed to really unleash our potential.
So I take it you may suggest, as I have, that in the way, of course, you know that Conservatives supported C5. We put forward major amendments to improve the bill. But wouldn't it make sense, instead of focusing on this legislation that does a workaround of laws and policies that clearly block building by their necessity of C5 having to be implemented, wouldn't it make much more sense to just fix those fundamentals to be able to give certainty to investors and proponents, so that projects and proponents are not still stuck in red tape, losing money and time? And to that, and to your end, to your whole point about basic infrastructure also being required in these areas, and all the elements that make it very easy for layering on of policies to make Canada uncompetitive globally. One of the things that boggles my mind is this key infrastructure of Indigenous-led roads to the Ring of Fire, for example, which is still stuck in limbo, and the government still hasn't given it the green light. Do you have any other points to expand on in terms of ensuring that we can accelerate approvals and provide clarity for Indigenous communities who want economic reconciliation and proponents and all Canadians everywhere?
Yeah, the favor that the C5 did for us is to outline, specifically in legislation, which are the main, source of legislation that are the problem, and allows the Major Projects Office, nationally designated projects, to work around those. But obviously, it's also telling us that all of those pieces of legislation need some reform so that all projects can benefit from more efficient processes. So I think, it's a great place to start, of giving what nationally designated projects may get through the MPO to give that benefit and that certainty to all projects. On the Indigenous side, and I'm sure we can get into this more, and I have more specific thoughts on some financial tools to get Indigenous partnership. But I think we should be looking at strategies that align industry and Indigenous interests, especially on the economic side. We've often, focused kind of on a rights and accommodation kind of discussion, and I think there's a lot more room and a lot more runway that we could be doing on economic incentives to make sure that Indigenous communities are partners and are benefiting sufficiently from these types of projects.
Just 30 seconds. Yeah.
If there's any other top priorities you would like to add to ensure that Canada, after a lost anti-development decade, can actually meet the Prime Minister's stated ambition of Canada becoming an energy superpower, directly opposed to the agenda they've actually implemented in the last 10 years, please share with that in the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, one more is labor disruption. So we talk about, pouring billions of dollars into ports and railroads, when the top priority, usually for shippers, is the labor disruptions we've been having at these places. And you can see, I've seen itineraries of strike calendars that Canada's going to have. So we have power under the Labor Code to be more forceful, more muscular in ensuring, a common, peaceful labor situation. So giving that certainty, instead of pouring money into a broken system, using the tools we do have to ensure that labor disruptions are minimized as we export.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. McKinnon for 6 minutes, followed by Mr. Simard. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here. I'm going to focus probably on Mr. Blum, because being a BC guy, I want to focus on BC. So, Mr. Blum, we've had testimony before this committee regarding the complex assessment processes that are involved in critical minerals development. They involve federal, provincial, or territorial and Indigenous groups. How would you fit into that? Are you guys decision makers, or would you be people who are putting forward proposals?
Thank you very much for the question. So our council are advocacy and policy support for the decision makers. The decision makers would be the communities, 204 communities in British Columbia. And as you're aware, there's provincial environmental assessments, there's federal environmental assessments, and there's First Nations environmental assessments. And I think part of the reason for Bill C-69 and the amendments in the British Columbia Environmental Assessment Act were to bring First Nations into the fold to work together on environmental assessments. So hopefully that answers your question, that First Nations rights holders impacted by a project are the ones that would participate in the environmental assessment.
Okay. So is it different for a ordinary organization to put forward a proposal for a mine versus an Indigenous group? Do you have any particular better access or more, I guess, direct access to getting an approval forward?
Well, usually mining exploration companies are the proponents. Their job often is to get a project explored, find a resource, and then get it into the environmental assessment process. Get a certificate. Once that certificate is realized, then usually what they do is they sell it to a major company for development. So I think that the successes that you're seeing now are when exploration companies partner with the First Nation on whose territory they're exploring. That is a recipe for a successful project.
Okay. So one of the things we were hearing, and you mentioned it yourself, was the need for free, prior, and informed consent. But we also know that capital needs to move quickly. These projects need to move much faster than they have been historically. There seems to be a conundrum here that if we're consulting adequately, how do we make sure that we have adequate consultation, but also get these decisions made in a timely manner?
Yeah, I think capital would flow quickly if they see that the First Nations are involved in participating with a project proponent. I think that's the success model that we've seen, and I would encourage more of that. Companies seeing the opportunity, if they want to raise capital, if you have the First Nation partner with you raising capital, it will flow much faster than if they weren't part of the team.
So are you saying that if companies can partner with First Nations groups, that may well improve their ability to get things done in a timely manner?
100% sure. Yes, I agree with that comment. And in addition, I mean, First Nations or Indigenous groups, if you're looking across the country, they have access to capital through the federal Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program and other federal infrastructure and provincial infrastructure funds. So besides private capital, First Nations have direct access to government capital, and so there's an additional benefit if a company partners with a First Nation.
To the Loan Guarantee Program and an earlier, to our early panel, do you think that has increased from $5 billion to $10 billion? But there was some concern that maybe the grants weren't large enough or they're restrictive in categories. What would you say to that comment?
Yes, I listened to the National Chief and her team respond to that, and I agree with her comment. It's a huge opportunity, this $10 billion loan guarantee program. But a First Nation that has interest in accessing it may not have that capacity to say, all right, what does this program mean? So they have an ability to acquire, I think, $200,000 of grant funding to essentially see if there's a project that's worth investing in with a partner. So I don't know if that's the sufficient amount. At least it's a start. We didn't see that with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And so I think it's a start, but I would think that federal government should maybe open that door to allow for a bit more flexibility beyond the $200,000.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. McKinnon. Monsieur Simard, 6 minutes.
Mr. Simard, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Exner-Pirot, can you hear me? Is the interpretation working? In your preliminary statement, you talked about the nomenclature of critical minerals and the way there were nuances, or should be nuances in the way they were categorized. Some minerals are on the critical minerals list, and there need to be tax advantages to that, but not all minerals get the same advantages, like phosphate doesn't get the same tax credit. I find it interesting. What I'd like to know from you, have you drawn up a table showing the categorizations you talked about? And in your view, would it require different strategies on critical minerals for us to move forward?
Project. Thank you so much for the question. I'll definitely be publishing that and have been thinking about it. But to your point, which I think will be of great interest to Quebec, gold, as you know, is not on the critical minerals list, and yet it is Canada's most valuable mineral product, mineral export. In fact, our second most valuable export at all, behind crude oil. And gold also acts, as a first mover in regions. It's a bit easier. It's, smaller mines, easier to process than most base metals. So you can develop a mining ecosystem and some mining infrastructure on the back of gold that makes it easier to then crowd in other commodities which you might want for battery minerals or defense minerals and that kind of thing. All of which to say is, yes, when we've been talking about critical minerals for too long. I will know we are sophisticated when we start talking about specific commodities, because the market for each commodity is different and the policy response is different for each commodity. And some markets are healthy. We are attracting investment into potash and uranium and gold right now. Some markets are extremely unhealthy, where China is putting on export restrictions, or there's some severe market manipulations. And so I think it's time that Canada starts sorting these. And I'll endeavor, sir, to write that onto paper and add my thoughts. And I think it'll be helpful for the government to do so as well.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. If in the meantime there's any information that you can provide to our analysts, that would be most likely very useful to us in drafting the report. Another essential aspect in developing critical minerals is infrastructure. What I've heard in the committee, what I've seen in consulting people who have mining projects, is that you need the infrastructure to access markets like rail and roads. No, not natural gas. We've never mentioned it. So in your view, is the federal government's current strategy sufficient to make it possible to deploy and build these infrastructures?
Yeah, great question. And again, this is where sophistication in what we're talking about comes out. The highest volume by far of what we're shipping is potash and metallurgical coal. And that mostly goes out of Vancouver, and grains as well. And so there's when you're talking about rare earths, you don't need to build whole ports or whole railroads, for some of these very small niche metals. And so where you don't need to put infrastructure in places where you're not going to have volume. But you do need infrastructure in some places. So we need to be so strategic. It can't just be throwing at the wall any railroad, any road, any port will do. You have to match it to where the deposits are and what the market is looking for. I have actually written a paper on critical minerals on the Arctic. That's what my PhD was focused on, was the Arctic, and I can submit it to the committee. But trying to look at, what are some ways that we can leapfrog? Railroads are extremely expensive. What are some technologies we could take advantage of to make it cheaper, more economic to do critical minerals development in northern remote places? Small modular reactors is certainly one, where transmission is very expensive, or where diesel is not only expensive but also bad for the environment. There's a tremendous potential, and everyone's looking at it, of small modular reactors, microreactors being able to be put in places where you need heat and power and can operate off-grid for industrial solutions. Also looking at airships, which has been, I know the government of Quebec has invested in, and I admire that they're looking at this innovation, but places where, where, again, a lot of these projects, it's the road. It crosses caribou paths, migratory animals. If you could have airships, which are low and slow, but very cheap to transport, require very few fuel requirements for some of the lighter metals, things that you could, fly out, gold, silver, rare earths. That would be a way to, again, access some northern remote locations without requiring a lot of infrastructure. And then just using, maximizing telecommunications to help address some labor force issues. So there's lots of smart people thinking about this issue. And I think we shouldn't knee-jerk towards the most expensive or the most obvious, 20th century solution to a lot of this unleashing.
Si vous avez de la documentation.
If you have documentation, I may not have much time left, but I will ask if you have any documentation on the logistics that would be needed to establish a supply to shipping or route for critical minerals. Please let me know. Mr. Chairman, do I have any time left?
No.
Traduction.
It's the lag in the interpretation.
So, sorry about that. Ms. We're on to our final round, and we will start with Mrs. Stubbs, 5 minutes, Monsieur Danko and Monsieur Simard. Mr. Danko for 5, and Monsieur Simard, you're back on for 2.5.
Thanks, Chair. Dr. Axner-Perot, I share your view that we have been hearing a lot of talk and a lot of rhetoric about critical minerals, and you're totally right about the so-called strategy that was announced in 2023, missing major categories that Canada should have been leading on already, since we are home to the second largest reserves in the world. So perhaps this will help you expand a little bit on Mr. Simard's questions, but also according to your own expertise. I wonder if you will speak more about northern critical mineral development, the challenges that Canada has against our global competitors, which is why the policy, environment, and legislation can make Canada and Canadian, especially junior explorers and producers, unable to compete. And also, if you do, because of your expertise, have any comments on tungsten?
Okay, well, fantastic. I know where this tungsten conversation is going. So there's nothing I want more than to have more northern economic development. But the fact is, almost any commodity you develop in the territories or in northern Quebec or northern Labrador is going to be much more expensive than even in southern Canada. And we're not a particularly cheap jurisdiction in the provincial north either. In general, it's about 2.5 times more to develop a base metal mine in the Arctic than it is in southern Canada. So you just have to have an extremely high commodity price and a line of sight on several years of a high commodity price to make those projects worthwhile. So anything you can do to reduce the costs and to reduce the timelines is very helpful, helps encourage that business case, which is already quite difficult. And where we have been seeing growth, though, is actually, again, is in gold and in silver and in diamonds. That's the vast majority of the mining that takes place in those territories is gold mining, is gold, silver, and diamonds, and those aren't considered critical minerals at all, but they're extremely important for regional economic development. So, cleaning up jurisdictional issues, making it easier for Indigenous communities to get to consent faster, and helping address some of the liability issues. I think in Yukon, they probably cost more to do mining than they make in mining because of all the liability, all the remediation that they have to do. I forget the second part of your tungsten.
Yes.
Tungsten.
Yeah. And everything you just outlined is exactly why the federal government cannot layer on anti-competitive policies and legislation that add costs and time for proponents, because that's the point you're making. But yes, move on and let's talk to us more about tungsten.
So we mentioned tungsten because it's on the NATO critical minerals list.
Correct.
And it's very important for hardening some materials that is very useful in defense equipment. And the United States, through the Defense Production Act, has given one of its 7 awards to a tungsten project near the Yukon Northwest Territories border, I believe. And Canada has, I think, matched it through NRCan. So it is some of these smaller mines where there maybe was, a deposit discovered a long time ago, or maybe even some brownfield, that it was mined in the 80s or 90s, that we could put back on the market much quicker. It's not the 18 years of a whole new greenfield mine. There's some projects that would be much closer to getting up and running. So that is where I do see quite a bit of optimism in the Arctic territorial kind of mining discussion, is to focus on those defense critical minerals, where obviously the state has an interest, and you could use some of our NATO defense spending targets to get some projects going there that may not be on their own in the market viable.
And especially in the case of tungsten, where the other I think there's 4 major plants or processors in the world, and other than in the United States, they're being produced out of countries that are not allies with Canada.
Yeah, well, this is true. Tungsten, manganese, actually, BC just approved was it manganese or magnesium mine yesterday. There's a few of these, but then again, this gets to your policy question. It's not easy to refine and process in Canada. These are often very energy intensive operations, and if you have a scarcity of electricity, if you have restrictions on the use of natural gas, and if you have a high industrial carbon price, again, this doesn't that those things don't happen and don't emit. It's just that they go to China to happen and to emit, and they become reliant on them for some key materials.
So it's so key that our own domestic government will take off these anti-development laws and costs so that our own developers can compete. And especially on this issue where Canada can play such a crucial geopolitical role, and it is all tied to both our critical mineral, rare earth metal, and core commodity development. And certainly I think the government should take your advice on reviewing their critical mineral strategy that they announced a number of years ago and have made no real, actually deliverable progress on at all.
Thank you both. And Mr. Danko, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. And as the member for Hamilton West Ancaster Dundas, United Steelworkers have been the backbone of Hamilton's economy for decades, and it's good to have our guests here as a backbone of the mining sector as well. I think we have a shared interest in getting projects to development faster, to get to production faster. That's a shared interest between government, industry, and also workers. And unfortunately, I think what we've heard today and what we've heard previously in this committee is that from our conservative friends, that often means cutting red tape. And what we've heard is that means cutting regulations, removing protections for the environment, removing protections for climate change, and removing protections for workers.
Point of order, Chair. If we're going to do this, we are going to get in a debate because nobody's going to put words in my mouth or misrepresent our position.
Ms. Stubbs, that is debate.
Garbage.
And
yeah.
So that is debate. And
well, let's not lie at this table then.
We're not allowed to use that word, as you know. And if you could let Mr. Danko proceed, he did offer you that courtesy as well.
Great.
Thank you. So as I was getting to my point, we've seen the fundamental conservative anti-union bias on display, where the fundamental rights of workers are seen as red tape. And I would like to give our United Steelworkers guests an opportunity to respond to the role of union workers in critical mineral development. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I am, hearing the repeated term sort of anti-competitive decade or whatever, and then, concerns that have been raised about, for example, workers having the right to strike, and, the need for reforms to the Canada Labour Code. We want the Canada Labour Code perhaps reformed in a different way that protects our constitutional right to strike, and that's something we don't take lightly. But I think that Canada's advantage is, in fact, that we do have strong workers' rights. Our members in mining are some of our highest paid members, and they've fought for that over decades, and they have high health and safety standards. And this is something that we think that is important as we're developing our critical minerals sector responsibly, is taking this, using this to our advantage. We do think that it can take too long to get, a mine from its initial stages into operation, but, it can't be at the expense of workers' rights. or the environment, or in consultation with Indigenous peoples. There are likely areas that where things could be streamlined a little bit, not denying that, but ultimately what we think is really important is that we're ensuring that we're actually using to our advantage the fact that mining workers are highly unionized, well paid. These are community supporting jobs, and that's essential as part of a critical minerals strategy, is to really to leverage that as much as possible. And then also, as we expand mining, to ensure that workers are involved and identify training needs, that we have essential infrastructure, not just in terms of the roads and rail and things like that, but in communities where mines are expanded to have, adequate health care, child care, schools. That's something that we hear from our members when there's new mines that open up. They don't necessarily want to move to a new community if they don't have essential services, schools, things like that. This is, the importance of having a comprehensive strategy here that also isn't just getting things done faster at the expense of the environment, at the expense of workers, at the expense of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. And you spoke in your opening statement and just now about the importance of bringing on workers in the skilled trades. That's beyond just the mining and critical minerals sector. That's something that's important for Canada as a whole. I wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on how the unions, whether steelworkers or unions in general, can be involved in training and getting more workers into skilled trades to participate in the industries that are critical to Canada's economy.
Yeah, I think, the skilled trades are important, but I'll also point out that one of the initiatives that our union is taking on, particularly in Western Canada, is that it's not just identifying the skilled trades and, the gaps that may be needed in ensuring that there's union involvement in identifying where there may be gaps or where workers are aging out of the workforce, those types of things, but also, production workers, other types of jobs that are in mines. And we're actually trying to develop some schools, mining schools, where we actually are directly involved in recruiting and training workers. We're not a construction union. That's been a model that's existed in other types of unions. We haven't done that so much, but that's something that we're really looking into and looking for funding for that as well. But we think we can play an essential role in identifying the needs of the existing and future workforce, and not just in the skilled trades, but also in other jobs that are needed.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Monsieur Simard, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. I'll seize the opportunity of having the USW here to ask a question about aluminium. You did mention it. If I remember correctly, the U.S. uses 4 million tons of aluminium per year. 3 million of that, or rather 2.8 million tons, come from Canada. When we talk about critical minerals, when we talk about metals like aluminium, what's needed is to create a value chain. That's essential. And what we're seeing is that there's never been a strategy in Canada, nor in Quebec. I rarely criticize the Quebec government, but there's never been that strategy to develop an aluminium value chain. So large aluminium smelters are largely dependent on the U.S. And in the Midwest, they're managing to pass on the tariffs. There's never been a real government willingness to provide the financial support and tie that to local processing. That's never existed. So I'd like to hear you on a value chain in aluminium. Thank you. I will answer in English, but I completely understood.
I think that this is true. In Quebec, you developed, the energy development to be able to create the cheap energy that's needed for aluminum, and then sending it to the United States. And they rely on that aluminum because they can't really produce it there. But it does highlight the need in Canada for more comprehensive industrial strategies so that we're actually able to use the products that are produced here in value-added manufacturing and creating those good union jobs, not just in resource extraction and then shipping it off, but actually having incentives for buying Canadian produced aluminum, the aluminum that's produced in Quebec by our members, and ensuring that we have incentives there, and that if public money is going to projects, that it has to be tied to using that aluminum or other materials that are produced in Canada. And so I think that is an essential component of this and a larger critical minerals strategy, to have that industrial strategy that links all of these different parts of the supply chain.
So that's your time, Mr. Simard. So we're going to go on to Mr. Tucker for 5 minutes, and Mr. Gay wrapping up at 5 minutes. Mr. Tucker.
Yes, thank you very much to our witnesses. We're talking about the Conservative position to our union friends today. And our position is that we want projects to go ahead. We would like the insane Liberal policies to be rolled back that has hurt us for 10 years so that your workers can get to work. And that is what our goal of our Conservative position is. And I think that's why a majority of the private sector members have voted for Conservatives.
Point of order, Chair. Could the member stick to relevance? Questions to...
That is debate, Mr. Danko.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And it is relevant because we've lost the whole decade. There's countless projects. We've heard earlier from First Nations people of hundreds of mining projects that have been shelved and killed because of Liberal policies that have kept it in the ground, and how that was so wrong for First Nations across Canada because of the powerful paychecks that those families could earn so they could provide to themselves. Do you feel that some of your members would share that, and that's why they voted Conservative in the last election, because of the disdain for C-69 that has kept projects shelved for too long?
I'll just say that our members have voted, they vote for every political party across the board, pretty much mirror the general population of Canada. But I mean, of course, our members want to see good jobs and the expansion of good jobs. There's no doubt about it. But they don't want to see it at the expense of health and safety, and they don't want to see it at the expense of their communities, right? So, you know, whatever happened in the past 10 years, I mean, I think looking forward is most important here to see we're in a moment here where we can really develop and create a critical minerals strategy where we are taking advantage.
Fortunately, it's the same government that is now carrying on these disastrous policies. And I, too, want environmental, sustainable projects that make sense, that have that First Nations involvement. And I think some of the most successful projects in Canada have been found in northern Alberta. And if you visit those First Nations, they are the most progressive, the most successful people, I would say, in North America because of those projects that were approved well before the Liberals took over and caused this lost decade. So just to clarify, that's our position, Conservative position. Moving a little bit to Dr. Exner-Perot, we talked about the importance of critical minerals to the defense of Canada. We've lost a decade where we are, instead of nation building, we had a decade of weakening our nation. If we could hear a little bit more about how critical minerals could help in the building, true building of Canada and the defense of our nation.
Yeah, certainly. And I just want to point out, I'm not anti-worker. My husband is a mining worker. He's up in the Northwest Territories on his 2-week shift right now. And I'm very concerned in him having access to market for the products that he helps produce. But in terms of the security aspect, so obviously, you know, we're all looking for economic growth. Everyone's aligned on that. Our allies are asking us almost daily for access to more critical minerals, trying to get off dependence of China. China has been very forcefully, muscularly using and manipulating markets, putting on export restrictions in the last 2 years and affecting supply chains here in North America. And so what can we do to adjust that? And Canada is in a unique position in the G7 and in NATO, is that we are really an export country when it comes to minerals. We are not a net importer. Some products, obviously, we import, but on the whole, we export. We have more than we could ever use ourselves. And that's not true of the United States, and it's not true of almost every one of our European allies. And so where they can't just, you know, go and mine something else or get a byproduct of an existing mine, as we can, and where we do have that capability, especially things that are on either the NATO defense materials list or on China's export restriction list, we should be doing very quickly. We should be doing so urgently. Again, this is not tending to be opening up a greenfield mine where you have to go through 15 or 18 years and get fresh consent from Indigenous communities. Oftentimes, it's just about processing what we already produce at these mines that we already refine and taking out some products that just wouldn't be economic if you left them on their own. And again, germanium, gallium, some rare earths, those would be top of the list. Antimony, tungsten would be the top of the list for us to start developing urgently to supply defense needs.
Yes, and thank you so much. Earlier, you had comments about how, unfortunately, in the world, we are surrounded by wolves, and the Liberals have made us into sheep, as a way of putting it. And I just want to unpack a little bit on your beliefs that how to get us in the front of our feet, because we know that it's taken 10 years with this good government to get us into this terrible position. How many years do you think it would take to get out of it?
A quick answer, please.
Yeah, well, all of which to say is we're producing a lot of things already. There's investment that wants to come to Canada. There's not a long list of great jurisdictions to put mining money in. And so a few policy tweaks, a few signals to the investment community that we really are open for business in the next 2 months would be fantastic.
Would that be repealing C-69 then?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Reforming, I would say. I would say reforming the Impact Assessment Act, and the Mining Association has put in lots of recommendations.
Thanks so much to you both. And Mr. Gay is going to get the last word. Mr. Gay, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Blum, question for you. One of the things in NRCan and the government that we are looking for is a lot of best practice or not less good practice, but that we can translate into list of elements to include in a First Nation. Because one of the things that as I became interested in the topic, I find interesting is depending on level of maturity of a First Nation, depending on the assistance that they have, depending on the appetite for risk that they have. Some want to be involved in the equity, some want nothing to do with the equity, some want to do it early, some want to do it later. And of course, in government, we try to create programs to help for the development with the First Nation. So I'm wondering what advice you have for us of where to focus from a participation perspective.
Thank you for the question. I've got lots of thoughts around that, but given the short amount of time, we have created in British Columbia, with Canada and with British Columbia, a regional energy and resource table. And that table started 2 years ago with a collaborative framework that was agreed to at a political level with the BC government, the federal government, and the First Nations Leadership Council. That table focuses on critical minerals and other areas, 5 other areas. And so I think there's a good start, continuing that table as we've got governments, 3 governments at the table. We also have a mining and consent paper, which was not part of my presentation, but that is on our website. And there's lots of information there on best practices. But if I'm to give you one quick example, the creation of a resource negotiation support team for those communities that don't have the expertise, which is a team of people that can come in and support a community that's looking for a negotiation on a project. I think that's one of our recommendations in the strategy, the critical mineral strategy, among 49 others.
Sorry, can I ask that since you didn't include that paper, that you supply it to the committee so that we can take it into consideration as we draft our report? So it would be much appreciated.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I think we're pretty much at the end of time, and that was my interested question.
Okay. So colleagues, let me on your behalf once again thank our witnesses for their testimony. Again, the offer is there to submit a brief if you wish. We'd appreciate it. And colleagues, I think you will agree we heard a diverse set of views, particularly on this last panel, and we heard a diverse set of views from colleagues as well. That's what committees are for, hearing strong and opposing views. But I dare say, colleagues, that there's a great deal of consensus, too, that I think we're hearing that will make its way into our final report. So I appreciate your focused questions today, and we'll see you back here on Monday. Anything else, Madam Clerk? We stand adjourned? We stand adjourned.
Could I have your blessing?
Thank you.